Hi folks, this is James with Geothermal Help. We're going to be talking about economics here of ground source heat pumps and the value that they have. There's three ways to represent the value of a ground source heat pump system. One can be represented by the payback. Payback is the relationship of how much money the system cost in excess of a conventional system, and then the relationship of how much energy savings it has and how long it will take to pay itself off. The other way is the time value way of looking at it. In other words, there's a time value of money and there's a time value associated with the energy savings of a system. And if we can compare and look at both of those, it's just a different way to review the value of a system. And the final way would be life costs of the system, and that is the cost of the installed system plus the energy that it will consume for its entire life as compared to a conventional alternative. Starting with the top one on payback, it's fairly simple to figure this out. We've got the ground source heat pump cost. So somebody's going to go out, you're going to get bids from multiple installers, or an installer that you trust is competent in providing you a good bid on a system. Keep in mind there's multiple ways to establish an earth loop. You've got closed loop systems, open loop systems. The cost variation between those is tremendous. And so, make sure we're working with a good number here. And then you've got the cost of your conventional system. That's straightforward. That's your furnace, that's your boiler, that's whatever else you would use if you didn't use a ground source heat pump. And then, but before we subtract that out, we need to take the incentives off the cost of the ground source heat pump system. The largest of those being the federal 30% tax credit, where there is no cap on that. And then there's also state tax credits in most states. And there may be electric co-op rebates, other things that reduce that upfront cost of the ground source heat pump. In any case, we're going to get a good bid on the ground source heat pump system. We're going to take off whatever incentives apply. We're going to subtract the cost of the conventional system from that, because we're assuming that the ground source heat pump is going to cost more than the conventional alternative. And that is usually the case. However, in some cases, if it's an open source system and you take the incentives off, there are situations where the ground source heat pump would cost less or the same as the conventional, in which case it's a no-brainer. It becomes a moot point. You don't need to really go any further into it. You're going to get energy savings with the heat pump. Why go with a conventional alternative if you can put it in for basically the same cost? In any case, assuming it's more, subtract that out, that's your X factor. How much more did you have to spend on it than your conventional alternative? Then we need to compare the energy savings of the ground source heat pump versus the conventional. Now we know the conventional is going to cost more. Is it fueled with propane? Is it natural gas? What is it? And what are the energy prices of that right now? And then what are the energy costs of the ground source heat pump? That's obviously an electrical load. So what is the rate for electricity? How much total energy is the structure expected to use throughout each year? So we can do a heat loss on that. We can look at other properties of that size, and we can get a fairly good guesstimate as to what the total BTU load of that structure will be throughout that entire year. And then we're going to know that per BTU delivered, the ground source heat pump is going to cost us this much money, and the conventional would cost us this much. The relationship there, how much money do we save per year, is represented as Y. And then we simply divide. X divided by Y is your payback in years. Pretty straightforward, but it takes a lot of getting good numbers in order to figure it out correctly. And again, a lot of people are operating with bids that are closed loop systems or closed loop vertical when an open loop might have been able to be in there. So it's important we get good numbers before we stand on this number and think that it's accurate. Now the second way to look at it, and the reason that this payback number may not be the best way to look at these systems, is that most people don't pay for that stuff out of pocket. Most people don't just buy X, come up with the cash value of X. They generally finance it. Now let's say it takes $10,000 to put in your ground source heat pump system over the cost of the conventional after the incentive. So the $10,000 is your X factor. And then your energy savings per year has been calculated out to be $2,000. And I believe that's accurate. If we look at $2,000 energy savings, if we're comparing it to propane, I think it's very accurate. In fact, it's probably a bit low. If we're comparing it to natural gas, it's probably high. It's going to completely depend on what fuel source we're comparing it to and the overall energy loads of the structure. But for this example, we're just going to use 2,000. And like I said, I've done plenty of these economic analysis on structures out here in Montana, and it's very reasonable to assume $2,000 for our example, if we're comparing it to propane. So that's a 5-year payback. Meaning we had to spend $2,000 a year energy savings. After 5 years of having the system in place, we then begin taking that $5,000 or $2,000 per year and putting it in our pocket that we otherwise would have given to the utility company on propane. So for 5 years we had to pay it out, then we start getting the benefits after that. But the point is that's still the payback way of looking at it. Who does this? Nobody pays the $10,000, or if you are, then great, you represent it this way. If you finance this $10,000, then we get into the time value. We're looking at the time value of money versus the time value of the energy savings that the heat pump would provide. So if this $10,000 were financed, and let's just use a high number. Let's say you went out and put it on your credit card, and you had it at 10 years at 15% interest. You borrowed that $10,000. That works out to be $161 per month it would cost you to finance the 10 grand times 12 means 12 months in a year. So it's going to cost you $19.36. So that's the cost of financing $10,000 for 10 years at 15% interest. So if this relationship is this way, where the $2,000 here is your annual energy savings, and $19.36 is your annual principal and interest payments on the loan it took to do it, then that means for 10 years, your energy savings is paying the principal and interest that it took to do it. So there really is no payback. It means in this example, you're making $64 a year. I mean, granted, that could be wiped out by fluctuations in energy, or it could be much greater than that if you were to finance the $10,000 at a lower rate. In any case, it's not important what the numbers are. It's important that we understand the relationship of the time value of money versus the time value of energy savings. And if the time value of the energy savings is greater than what it's going to take in anyone's particular circumstance to borrow that money, whatever the number is and at whatever rate you're borrowing it at, if this is higher than this, then it becomes a no-brainer situation. And then the final way to look at it would be the life cost of the system. So if we can determine that it's a $2,000 per year energy savings, and we said before it was going to take 5 years to pay that back, but let's say it's a 30-year lifespan of your system, then we know we've paid off the added cost after the 5. So let's take 2,000 times 25 years to see what sort of energy savings we're going to get over the life of it. We're going to see $50,000. Now that's a big number. Now I don't know, and I didn't represent what this system cost to put in the first place. We know that after 5 years it had already retired the money that it took in above and beyond the conventional system, and at that point forward it starts putting all that money into your pocket, or think of it this way, it starts paying back what would have been the conventional system's cost. By the end of it, it looks like it may very well have paid off probably the entire cost of the system, and then some in energy savings. So I think if we learn to represent the economics of the ground source heat pump in these 3 different ways, and we don't just look at it as a payback, paybacks sometimes don't occur if energy savings outweighs financing cost. Let's learn to think about it in that sense, and then also really look at the life cost of it. It tends to really, really hit home on the value of ground source heat pumps, and I'm hoping that if people understand more of that, we'll put more of them in service. Thank you.